Hey, Sterling cousins. Y'all already know what time it is. Get a blanket, get a blunt, get some water. Like the video. Subscribe. You should already be subscribed, but subscribe if you haven't already. 3 true home invasion stories. Like, what? How bad could it be? Probably pretty bad. But we'll see, right? SSG Animations. Don't forget, y'all can always go and watch the videos that I watch by yourselves on their channel. Yeah, and be sure to go subscribe to them because I'm subscribed to them and I like every video that I watch.
I grew up in a single-parent household. Just me, my sister, and my mom, with my grandpa occasionally lending a hand with parenting duties. And when I was about 4 or 5 years old, we were broken into, twice. I didn't know all the details of the whole thing until years later. Like I have vague memories of moving apartments and some cops coming over to the house, but I was pretty much kept in the dark until I was old enough to handle what had gone down. For the first break-in, we were all out grocery shopping, so my mom didn't realize anything had happened until we got home. There was an open window, open drawers. The way my grandpa tells it, it's like my mom interrupted them in the middle of doing something and they climbed out of a second-floor window as soon as he'd heard us arrive. That, or whoever it was, just didn't care about people knowing he'd been there. The second break-in happened 3 months later, only this time the guy broke in at nighttime while we were all asleep. I had to get all this from my grandpa because understandably my mom hates talking about it, but the way he tells it, she basically woke up in the middle of the night and sensed a presence in the room with her. Not like a spirit or anything dumb like that, like an actual person. Then when she opened her eyes, there was someone standing next to her bed with something shiny in his hand.
What'd you do?
She told Grandpa she was literally frozen with terror. Couldn't move, couldn't talk, literally petrified in the very sense of the word. Apparently the guy was mumbling something, but Mom couldn't remember exactly what. Then by the time she started begging him not to hurt her, she couldn't hear anything at all. My sister remembers walking into her room, thinking that she was having a nightmare. She asked Mom if she was okay. Mom threw the covers from over her head, saw the guy was gone, then noticed the second-floor window was open where the guy had used the same escape route as the first break-in. She put my little sister back to bed. I obviously have no memory of this because I was asleep. She called 911, then she called my grandpa. Grandpa said the cops found faint, muddy footprints all over the house, including in our bedrooms, so he'd obviously taken his time exploring the place before he'd woken my mom up. Only, this guy hadn't just been exploring. He'd been very, very busy, and it actually took us a few days to uncover all the bizarre little things he'd done, things which spoke to just how insane this person really was.
What did he do?
The next day, when we noticed that the cat wouldn't touch her milk, Mom poured it out into the sink, thinking that it had gone sour, then got the distinct smell of bleach as she did so. She can't be certain,
He tried to kill
but she
your
thinks
cat?
the guy poured bleach into the cat's milk, wanting to kill it. Then there was the cracked empty eggs in the fridge. Not like cracked all the way, just little holes in the top with all the yolk and egg white missing. It's possible he just poured them down the sink, but Grandpa thinks the guy might have been sucking them raw. Not all that scary, I know, just freaky, you know?
Eggs are expensive today.
Mom says some meat was missing from the fridge too. Raw meat. But I know Grandpa used to feed our cat from the fridge too, so we can't rule that out.
Nah, he in there
A few days later, Grandpa came over in the evening for some dinner and offered to help prep for garbage day.
And trying to kill the cat.
He says one of the garbage cans spilled right as he got into the driveway, complains to my mom about tin cans in the garbage or whatever, and then goes on to clean up and finds what spilt it. Someone, presumably the guy who broke in, had thrown a pair of scissors in the trash, along with a clothing catalog he'd been cutting up. He cut the heads off almost every single motto in that catalog, and the little paper heads were nowhere to be found. My grandpa thinks the guy took them as some kind of trophy, but who knows what he really did with them. Then there was the salt in my mom's work shoes, the knife missing from her knife block in the kitchen, obviously the shiny thing he'd been holding when she woke up to him in her room.
I love my kitchen knives.
Anyways, the cops got plenty of fingerprints, but whoever it was didn't have a record, and other than the muddy boot prints they found, there was nothing much to go on. So to this day, no one's been arrested for it, but my grandpa thinks he knows who it was.
Who was it?
Years later, after we moved apartments twice in a bid to avoid the guy, a friend of a distant relative ended up getting locked up in some kind of psychiatric hospital. The guy had become obsessed with Alice in Wonderland, had all the books, multiple copies of them too, and all he ever talked about was the Looking Glass or Wonderland and all this stuff. It might just be a complete coincidence, but
what I gotta do with
the
your
thing
mom?
is, that's my mom's name, Alice. She's over the whole thing now. It's been more than 20 years since all of that, but I know that if she doesn't like talking about it, even today, it had to have messed her up for a while.
It definitely did. And mind your business on it and leave it alone.
Home
You wasn't even old
to
enough to know.
where you feel safe and secure from the rest of the world. A sanctuary where one can be themselves at the core.
Yes.
Home is where you live and love with your family.
They all blinked
But
at the
once
same
in a
time,
while,
and that was
too
wild.
often if you ask me, an invasion violates the safety of that space, and it's not something one comes back from easily. I'm Lisa, and this is my story of how I had a nightmare come true. I was married at 19 to the love of my life. I moved from Utah out to Virginia, far away from everyone I knew and loved. My husband works for the government, and his job is classified a lot of the time. I'm not entirely sure what he does, but he was traveling overseas for months at a time during the first decade of our marriage. We had our first child, and with our growing family, we moved to a luxury home in Leesburg, Virginia. My husband being overseas a lot felt lonely, but I at least had my dog Bailey and my 6-year-old daughter Autumn. I was also
Why'd you
pregnant
do
with
like
my
that?
son. His job also allowed me to live in the beautiful home that I have. One night, we all had gone to bed.
Grateful.
Autumn in her room, me in mine with Bailey. It was around 6 in the morning when I opened my eyes and heard something stirring downstairs. I assumed it was Autumn getting up to get herself some cereal, so I dozed back off. My eyes shot open at the sound of my daughter screaming, and I rushed downstairs to find her restrained by a man wearing all black, including a ski mask. He had a gun pointed at me. For context, we had a security system, and I have no idea how he got in the first place. My dog wasn't even barking, and though her tiny body was no match for the man in the house, she would usually bark her brains out. Make one wrong move, and this bullet goes through her head. I held my hands up in surrender. I'll do anything you want, just please don't hurt my daughter. I don't want any trouble, ma'am. Just give me your jewelry, that PlayStation, and that TV. Take all of it, just please don't hurt her. Go gather it up for me. I'm going! Autumn was crying out for me. Mommy, please hurry. He's hurting me. Don't worry, sweetie. I won't let him hurt you. I frantically rummaged through my drawers for my jewelry. I honestly didn't have that much, and it wasn't worth anything. I gathered it all up, hoping it would be enough for him to let go of Autumn. I put it all in a bag and took it downstairs, tossing it in front of him. He looked down at the bag and scoffed. That's it? It's all I have. He flashed a sinister grin at me through the ski mask. No, it isn't, he said as he glared at my wedding ring. Please, not this. It's my wedding ring, and this is so special to me. Put it in the bag, he yelled and pressed the gun barrel against my daughter's head. I jumped as he yelled, and with a shaky hand, I took off my diamond ring and placed it in the bag. The PlayStation and the TV, now! I nodded and went about unplugging the PlayStation and started to unmount the TV from the wall. The entire time I had to listen to my poor daughter cry as the man held her against her will. Tears began streaming down my face from the helpless feeling I had. We were being robbed, and I had no choice but to comply with him if I wanted to save my daughter's life. It was completely violating to have someone in your home, threatening your child, trying to boss you around. I felt enraged, and there wasn't a thing I could do about it. Once I unmounted the TV, he pointed the gun at me. "Get down on your knees." "I gave you everything you wanted. Now give me back my daughter." "Who the hell said I was done, bitch? You can have my jewelry. You can have the PlayStation. You could take the TV, and I'll even throw in all of my credit cards. You can't bring me to my knees. Plus, I'm obviously pregnant, and it's hard to get on my knees." He pressed the gun into my daughter's head. I said, "Get on your knees." I struggled but managed to get down on my knees and looked at my daughter, who was sobbing. "It's gonna be okay, baby girl." My dog came running into the room and began barking her brains out up at the guy. Autumn and I both screamed at the top of our lungs when he shot my sweet puppy and she dropped dead. "Bailey!" Somehow, Autumn was able to shake away from his grip as he was distracted from shooting the dog and ran into my arms. I grabbed her hand and ran past the man, shoving him down, and got Autumn outside. I began to scream for help and banged on the neighbor's door. They opened up, and as I went to go inside, I felt a sharp pain in my leg and collapsed to the ground, landing on my stomach. I turned to see the man running up to us. He shot my neighbor in the chest, and he collapsed dead in front of me. "Autumn, lock the door and call the police." "I don't know how, Mommy." "Just dial 911 and give them our address." I watched as the man dove for my daughter. That's when I opened my eyes, drenched in a cold sweat from the horrific dream I just had. I sat up and saw that the sun was starting to come up and Bailey was sleeping peacefully next to me. I blew out a sigh of relief that my dog was okay.
Don't you play with us!
I rolled out of bed and went to go check on my daughter. For context, closed doors bother me, especially since I had my daughter and she sleeps in a different room. I like to keep it open at night in case she's had a bad dream and needs to come into my room with me. I went out of my room and began to walk down the hall when I heard some rummaging going on downstairs in my living room. I froze in place and listened closely. A part of me wanted to believe that Autumn was downstairs getting herself some cereal. I stood there convincing myself of that when I glanced towards her room to find her sleeping in bed. I felt the blood drain from my face and my breath began to shake. I was torn in that moment. I didn't want whoever was downstairs rummaging around in my things. The seconds ticked by slowly, yet I knew I needed to act fast. You're all probably thinking the logical thing would be to grab my daughter and barricade her and myself in my room. You would be right. But when you wake up from a nightmare like that and hear that someone has truly broken into your house and tripped the alarm, logic goes out the window. A racing mind is a frantic mind. You only want one thing, for yourself and your kids to be okay. My daughter is sensitive, and I knew if I woken her, it would have put us in a worse situation, and she would be traumatized. I couldn't exactly wake my dog and bring her into Autumn's room with me, as she would bark and draw attention to us. I was feeling clammy as panic began to set in, and I knew that if the man started walking upstairs, we were done for. With my daughter being 6, she's a bigger girl, and it would have been a struggle as I stopped carrying her after I got pregnant with my son. All these things were racing through my head with the pressure of my son sitting on my bladder. I worried that the nightmare I had was about to come true. This man would somehow have my daughter with a gun pointed to her head, my dog barking and being shot at and dying. I stood silently in the middle of the hall, fighting the raging battle in my head of what I needed to do. What was worse, I remembered that my pregnant brain took me to bed without my phone the night before, and it was downstairs. Probably already snatched by the bastard that got into my home. I'm not sure what happened, but as luck would have it, the man just left my house. I went into Autumn's room and could see him running away down the street. I rushed downstairs and saw nothing was taken. I checked my alarm system and, of course, I forgot to set it after locking up the house. I grabbed my phone and reported the break-in to the police. They came by and were able to get fingerprints on the guy. I don't know if they found him. What I do know is I'm never forgetting to set the alarm again. Sadly, we moved to Australia a couple years after this incident, and I had to leave Bailey with my mom. She ran out in the street and was hit by a car.
Poor Bailey.
By Megan McCall, based on a true incident with my sister.
My father, Pat, grew up in a tall grass country in Butler County, Kansas, on a 5-acre truck farm about 3 miles outside the town of El Dorado. He was born in a sharecropper's house at exactly 8 a.m. on March 10th, 1931. It had snowed so much that the doctor wasn't able to get his car out to deliver the baby. And so, my grandfather called the town vet and asked him to come because he had a sleigh and therefore could get through to the house. My grandmother never forgave him for that. My grandfather, my father's father, Lester, was finally able to buy some land when Pat was about 5 years old. So he bought acres directly across the road from the sharecropper's house Pat was born in. And there, he built a stone house for his growing family, and he and my grandmother turned the land into a truck farm. It was during the Great Depression, so times were tough, and my grandmother Audrey took care of a lot of people with the food they grew and the animals they had. She never turned anyone away, and Pat never forgot what he learned from Audrey, and because of that, and who he was, took care of those in need all his life. Even when he was desperately poor himself, he always managed to find a surplus to take care of others. My father was an exceptionally intelligent and adventurous person, and was a fantastical, wonderful storyteller. He was the best storyteller I've ever heard, and many, many folks I knew would agree with that, hands down. I have a plethora of his stories I plan to tell, and this is one of them. As a child, Pat roamed the prairie, woods, and creeks for miles around the farm when he wasn't busy with his chores. He was a curious and inventive child who was happy playing by himself as he was with his friends. He loved to make jewelry out of things that he found in nature to give to his mother. This became a lifetime fascination. As he grew into an adult, he used what he could find to make incredible sculptures and jewelry. He was a fabulous artist, and I am blessed to have a small collection of his sculptures and jewelry. Of course, living on a farm, as all children that do, he had jobs to perform each day. One of those chores he and his older brother Gene had was to milk the cows. They had to be milked twice a day. Since Pat did not like to get up early, and Gene did, Pat milked the cows in the evening. To get to the barn, you had to go through the chicken yard, which had 2 gates on either side. You had to open the latch and unlatch the gates as you passed through, so the chickens wouldn't escape. One night, when Pat was about 10 years old, during the late fall when it was very cold and got dark early, he prepared, as he always did, to go out and milk the cows. He bundled up in his jacket and put on his boots and lit the lantern so he could make his way. He went out the back door, walked down the stairs, and slowly crossed the backyard, taking his time as children do when they're shouldered with a chore. He got to the chicken yard and unlatched the first gate, and after passing through, latched it again. He was ambling along, daydreaming, looking down just in front of him, since the lantern didn't fall more than a couple feet in front of him. The chicken yard was kind of large, so it took him a minute or two to cross and get to the second gate. He passed through, made sure the gate was latched as well, and slowly headed towards the barn door. He wasn't looking forward to milking the cows in the dark and cold. As he came up to the barn door, an eerie feeling suddenly came over him, though he knew not why. As he took his next step, there, in a pool of light right in front of him, were a pair of gnarled, old bare feet.
Ew.
He slowly looked up, his mind barely able to comprehend what his eyes just beheld. For there was a bent and twisted thing, seemingly covered in rags. As his eyes continued upward, there atop of the shoulders sat a face from the depths of hell. The eyes were wild and red, the hair long, gray, and wiry, sticking out in every direction. The lips were pulled back tightly in a terrible snarl over yellowed and broken teeth. This thing, for which he wasn't entirely sure what it was, made a strangled, choking cry and reached out towards Pat with a gnarled, clawed hand. At that moment, a great surge of adrenaline numbed his thoughts of all but flight. Shaking with fear that he'd never known before, he dropped the lantern, turned on his heel, and began to run for his very life, all while screaming hysterically for his father to come save him. His voice was now so high in his throat it seemed to strangle him. He reached for the first gate and somehow he got the latch undone and was through, flying on wings of fear as fast as his feet could carry him. As he ran across the chicken yard, he could hear the creature right at his heels making the strangest, most horrible sounds that he'd ever heard.
Hurry up, Pat.
The noises were not human. They sounded like the demon Pat was sure this was. He made it to the second gate, managing to unlatch it just as he felt claws grab at his shoulder, catching at his coat. He managed to pull free, still screaming for his father to come help and save him. At that very moment, when he was sure that he was about to be caught and done unto, his father appeared on the back porch, shotgun in hand. He rapidly cocked the gun while threatening to shoot. But the creature had already disappeared into the dark. Lester assured Pat that he was now safe while steering him up on the back porch stairs and into the kitchen where his mother could comfort him. Then Lester set out to find the intruder and spent the next hour patrolling their property, looking for the old demon man. But nothing and no one was to be found. Several days later, Lester came home with his poor tale. There was an insane asylum some 6 miles or so outside of El Dorado, and one of the inmates had escaped and wandered off that very night of Pat's near mishap. He had been picked up the very next day, about another 10 miles away. What a poor old fool. However, many months afterward, Pat was terrified of going to the barn alone after dark, and would beg his brother Gene to go with him.
No.
Which he never would. Needless to say, from then on, he did his best to milk the cows before dark.
Exactly.
Though in winter, that could be difficult.
That was a good one. What? Almost got little old Pat.
This happened last year.